Welcome back to the Vandy 24/7 podcast. I'm Joey Dwyer. And man, is it good to be back at Hawkins Field. We'll have probably some more casual stuff like this throughout the year, but wanted to start off today solo. Vanderbilt just finished up its first baseball presser of the spring. Tim Corbin, JD Rogers, and Miller Green talked. Learned a little bit, not a ton, as you generally don't with Corbin this time of year. He's been around baseball a long time, is often hesitant to make declarations, make predictions, or really anything about his roster at this point of the year, but you get some senses for kind of how he feels about what he has, and I thought we did today. I think the main story, start off with Matthew Polk, will not be with the team this year. He's not on the roster, and this had been thrown out for a little bit, but Polk, I think, would have been a factor this year. I don't think there's a huge question about that. Pulling up his numbers from last year, 316 average, 372 on base. So there's obviously something there, and I thought he played himself into the lineup at times last year when didn't necessarily even come into the season as a starter. Jacob Humphrey got hurt, and I thought Polk had a nice year in the absence of him and really overtook him even when he came back. So that's a loss for Vanderbilt, and Corbin didn't really give any specifics, and I'll refrain from speculating about any of those, but that's a guy that I think they're going to miss. Does it change their outlook a ton? I don't know. I think they've still got enough on the roster, and Corbin seemed pretty confident in what they have. He said they as a staff are kind of playing the mental game of what lineups are we going to throw out there and what does it look like defensively, and I still think he's got a lot of that to figure out. I think maybe more so than even he has in the last couple of years. A guy who I think fits in now even more so is JD Rogers. We talked to him and talked to him a little bit after. There'll be a story with some exclusive quotes on the site later today, but JD Rogers, I think, could be a guy who really makes an impact. He told me today that he thought he broke through this summer at the Cape Cod League. I thought he had a really nice summer, really showed some pop. And I think in the SEC, there's a lot of venues that play to JD Rogers' strengths. That'll be a guy who I think adds some pop to their lineup in some senses. And Corbin did say that based off the way they kind of measure things, they feel like they have a little bit more pop. Last year, he didn't even say he thought, he said he knew just because of the metrics they've used, and I think a lot of that comes from Chris Maldonado. He said this was a different Chris Maldonado that he's seeing now than it was this time last year because he's stronger, he's more physical, and I think that could add some power to their lineup as well. Colin Barcy and Braden Holcomb have both had to take some steps as well, and I think if they're going to be a good lineup in 2025, it's going to be those two guys who are doing a lot for them. Corbin said today that he thought that Holcomb has worked a lot with Jason King and has done some good things there, so that's a good sense of a positive from today. I think the leadership is another thing that you hear a lot about this time of year from Tim Corbin, and you obviously don't know until later in the year exactly what he has there, and neither does he, but he seemed to have a good idea that there are enough veterans on this roster that can take some of that into their own hands a little bit. He mentioned a lot of older guys, a lot of guys like JD Rogers, even Ethan McIlvain made an appearance there. He said Jonathan Bastine has matured a lot mentally, and I think that's a big step for them too. That's a guy that I think is going to really help them out this year. That was a big addition for them coming back, obviously, but overall it just seems to me like they seem to have a different attitude about them in some senses, and that doesn't mean that they have necessarily an alpha like we've been wanting them to have for years. I think the last time they really had that was Enrique Bradfield, and maybe to look even further, you look at Kumar Rocker, Jack Leiter, as guys who did that at a higher level. But right now, I just think they have a lot of guys who are kind of fighting to become leaders. Maybe fighting is not the best word, but kind of trying to get a feel for where their leadership is needed and kind of how they do that. And I think you're kind of seeing that now within the locker room. So Tim Corbin has kind of vocalized that a little bit, and he seemed a little bit more optimistic about leadership this year than when I asked him the same question last year. And I think that matters, and I think that was something that they were lacking a little bit, kind of a result of that leadership. And this is on the site now if you want to read it. Vanderbilt baseball, I think, has a different kind of feel to it. As Miller Green said, I think they are a little bit more hungry. They have a little bit more of an edge to them, and it's too early to know that for sure. And I don't think this program is ever going to have the edge that a team like Tennessee had last year, or a lot of teams that they'll see, but you can tell that they did not like the way things ended last year. They didn't like kind of how things played out in terms of their roster, in terms of their leadership a little bit. And I think that is something that's motivated them a little bit. JD Rogers said today, it's definitely lit a fire underneath us. He said, us being seniors and where we are now and being leaders of the team, we have a new mindset of how we wanted to lead this team and how we wanted to lead this group. that developed early in the fall. Now we're seeing that come to fruition a little. I think Tim Corbin kind of echoed that as well. He said the team's hungry. He said there's a lot of benchmarks in this program. There's a lot of places that these guys haven't gone. A lot of these guys haven't been to Omaha. Guys who have been around here for a couple of years, they haven't experienced what it's like to be at the mountaintop and what it really means for this program to be there. So I think this group is kind of hungry to get there. Miller Green said everybody's ready to change what the past 3 years have had happen and what Vanderbilt's done. And he said they're ready to take the next step. And all this is preseason talk. Everybody talks good in the preseason, right? Jerry Stackhouse's last team talked about how they were a special defensive team in the preseason a few years ago, and I don't know that showed even for 5 minutes of a game. So you never really know at this time of year, but I get the sense, and we're going to see him later scrimmage at 4 o'clock. That's actually open to the public if anyone wants to be here, but I get the sense that they have more physically imposing bats in the lineup. They have more pop, and I think their pitching is still kind of something that they're trying to figure out. I think they have a lot of guys who they're trying to stretch out right now. They've mentioned they're stretching out Sawyer Hawks a little bit. Miller Green is getting stretched out a little bit, so even bullpen guys are, but I get the sense that that's going to be a little bit of a work in progress, and finding the right lineup is too. But when you have a guy like Brody Johnston, who is a really physical guy, has a lot more pop than a lot of Vanderbilt's freshmen have had in recent years, and he's not necessarily having the pressure of having to play every day if he's not ready. I think that matters, and I think that is going to be a guy that earns his way into the lineup. Rustin Rigdon, I think, is another guy they're pretty high on. Tim Corbin often doesn't rave about freshmen the way he did with him today. He talked about how he's such a good presence in the box, and appeared to think that he's a little bit more mature than a lot of his guys have been. Rigdon and Mike Mancini, the James Madison transfer. Obviously, James Madison's been pretty kind to Vanderbilt recently. They have both played the infield and the outfield. I wouldn't be surprised if a few more infielders ended up moving to the outfield just to kind of see how they want to simulate things. I still think they're trying to figure out kind of what that all looks like, because obviously with Polk being out, you kind of have to fill some holes in the outfield, and they're going to have to experiment with that even once the season starts a little bit. But I think their freshmen are going to have opportunities to get on the field, and I don't think that they're necessarily pressured into doing that, right? I think you don't have a ton of guys who are pigeonholed into one spot, or a bunch of guys that you're necessarily thinking, well, he's slotted in here, and I think that can be a good or a bad thing. I think they've got a lot of guys who they know are going to play, right? They know Braden Holcomb's going to play. They know Chris Maldonado is going to play. They know Jonathan Vassine's going to play at shortstop. They know RJ Austin's going to play. I think everything right now at this point of the year, obviously we're only 2 or 3 weeks away, I think you're still kind of figuring out where everybody fits, and they're going to figure that out throughout the year, but they're starting to get a little bit more of a sense for that right now too. So I thought it was a day that encouraged me if I'm a Vanderbilt fan, listening to Tim Corbin talk, and you kind of always feel that way this time of year, but it feels like there's maybe a different sense of pride being taken in this year, and that's not to say there hasn't been in the past, but these guys don't want to lower the standard around this program, and it feels like this is a big year for it just because of that. Because if you go and get out of 4 straight regionals, that is a real step back. So big year for Tim Corbin and his team, right? This is a team that could change the trajectory of kind of how this works a little bit, and if they continue to do what they've done the last 3 years, I think that would be really demoralizing for a program like like this. But man, I think there's a lot up in the air still, and we'll talk more in the next couple of days about what we think the lineup looks like, what we think the rotation looks like. Obviously, Ethan McIlvain and J.D. Thompson are probably factors there. Cody Boker's a factor there, but a lot to be determined, and a lot for this team out in front of it. But today, first look at Vanderbilt baseball, and we'll see them later. Follow the site for updates from the scrimmage, takeaways from the scrimmage, and follow the site for an exclusive with J.D. Rogers later today. Thank you guys for watching. God bless. We'll talk soon. Peace.